Hello, this is Rama Lakshmi, and welcome to the Prince Page Turner. I'm here to talk about a brand new book. It's called Shattered Land: Five Partitions and the Making of Modern Asia, and it's by the first-time author Sam Dalrymple. And hello, Sam. Welcome to the Print.
Hi, Rama. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's a delight. Sam, you can say, is a resident of the borders. For the past few years, he has basically become the Wordsworth of borderlands. Constantly posting from different areas of the borders, and why certain borders came together, why they split, trying to understand the psyche of borderlands, people who live in the borderlands, the commerce that takes place along the borders, and that's why I call him the Wordsworth. And he brings to us a sense of old stories with new wrinkles. He brings those new wrinkles to it, but always, almost always, with a touch of an aching sense of something lost, more so than what's lost than what's gained. But yeah, he brings us these really fascinating stories, and this book is really interesting in the lens that it brings to our understanding of the past, especially colonialism. And let me dive straight into the book, Sam. It's a book that tells us that it's time to reconfigure how we look at India's past and also colonialism. Let me give you the premise of the book. Between 1937 and 71, he says the Indian Empire went through five partitions. Now, when we think about partitions, we think about India, Pakistan predominantly. Of course, there are those who think about Bangladesh as well, but mostly India's political imagination and popular cultural imagination has been dominated by Pakistan. But Sam brings us five partitions. Do you want to quickly run through that list of five partitions that you're talking about that happened between 37 and 71, where the Indian Empire was also produced five nation states?
Sure. So this book came out of the rather unexpected discovery that in the 1920s, 100 years ago today, the Raj was much bigger than we tend to remember, stretching from Aden in what's now Yemen, all the way to modern Burma in the east, to Rangoon, etc. Um, and although I think a lot of people have previously known this but thought of it as mere administrative ties, um, the fact is that everyone within this area was allowed to have Indian passports, etc. And the five partitions that I cover are first the separation of Burma in 1937. Secondly, the separation of the Arabian states, so the separation of Aden and this bizarre story of how Dubai very almost became part of modern India. The third one is the partition of British India, the Great Partition, which is the one that I think we tend to know about with Cyril Radcliffe dividing the Punjab, dividing Bengal, etc. Um, the fourth one is the forgotten fact that 80% of the modern India-Pakistan border was not drawn by Cyril Radcliffe, but was drawn by the decisions of essentially seven Indian princes. And how did that stretch of the border from basically Sindh and Gujarat right the way through Rajasthan and, of course, the line of control? How did these kind of ruptures come into being? And the fifth partition is the one that takes place in 1971, the creation of Bangladesh, the division of Pakistan, and the subsequent 3 years of essentially dividing assets and dividing people. So between 1971, the creation of Bangladesh, and 1974, the largest repatriation of humanity occurs, with planes taking, Urdu speakers from Bangladesh to Pakistan, taking Bengalis from Pakistan to Bangladesh, and all sorts of other ones. So those are the five partitions, and yeah, it's a different way of framing the history of the 20th century.
Yeah, you kind of shifted the lens for us, for many of us. Are you trying to tell us through this book the story of these waves of nationalism that swept the empire, the Indian empire, from different corners? Or are you essentially telling us that we are, for most part, incompatible people?
No, I think I'm trying to say precisely the opposite. The fact that there are so many different ways that this could have gone, I think is one of the key things that I'm aiming to say. The fact that, and one of the big things that I was surprised by is that essentially until 1946, a year before partition, the partition was not inevitable. You still could have had a united India. Burma, today we see the border between Burma and India as inevitable and obvious in some sense, and yet there's arguably Burma's most important politician of the 1930s called Mahatma Uttama, who was a disciple of Gandhi's, basically fought for his entire life to keep Burma as the easternmost province of India, and even later became Savarkar's predecessor in the Hindu Mahasabha. This fascinating and very much forgotten character who argued that Burma was an integral part of Bharat, etc. Um, there are unexpected stories of kind of, many of the founding fathers of Yemen had at one point been Indian nationalists. There's this guy, Muhammad Ali Luqman, who, although he later writes about creating a country called Yemen, in his 20s, he's Ambedkar's travel buddy and is a fervent kind of, cadre of the Indian National Congress. And these are stories that we've forgotten. And I think we've forgotten the links that tie us all together.
Right. You say in your book that the Britain was probably at that time went from being the largest Muslim power
Mm.
to a country with a Muslim minority today, a tiny Muslim minority is what you call it. When you look at your own country through this lens, how does it
Mm.
change the way you look at this, where we are today, where Britain is
Well,
today?
I think it's fascinating, and I think that one of the things that triggered me to write that sentence, which some people have taken disagreement with, and yet you literally have Churchill using that phrase. Churchill himself talks about Britain should be considered the largest Muslim. Britain should be considered the largest Muslim country in the world, or we rule over more Muslims than any other nation state in history, and we are. He calls Britain the largest Muslim power, is what he calls it. Um, and I think that seeing how interlinked these places all once were, and I mean, it's in very many cases, there are huge benefits that have come from severing these ties, as we see with, for example, Britain had been in India for centuries, and I don't think anyone's mourning Britain receding from Indian shores, and yet you wander around Kolkata and you see these buildings that tell you of this kind of age that's now been forgotten. You see the Victoria Memorial, and you see, arguably um, the largest building activity that the British Empire ever really constructed is sitting in Bengal. Um, and I think that today in Britain, in a post-Brexit Britain, where immigration and changing demographics are at the top of the political agenda, I think it's important to remember that essentially the British Empire is why these people are here in the first place. Like it's not Indonesians and Vietnamese people who are living in Britain today, people who were colonized by the French and the Dutch. It's people who the Britain once ruled, people whose countries that Britain once invaded, basically.
And how does that observation that you've made in this book and also what you remember Churchill is saying, how does that speak to the present moment right now when you have a certain kind of politics and political rhetoric coming up about Muslims and about immigrants? How should the present Britain see it?
Well, I think Britain just needs to remember its past more. I think Britain has this obsession with immigration and ties to the rest of the world, somehow beginning in the wake of World War II with the HMT Windrush arriving near, docking near London, and the first Afro-Caribbean sort of community coming off. Of course, immigration, mass immigration to Britain did begin there, but of course, there had been ties long, long before, and Brits had been elsewhere. The difference is that that's the moment that people from ex-colonies begin coming to Britain as opposed to vice versa. Um, and so I think, and I think it's a crucial part of the legacy that we can't ignore. And I think particularly with increasing racist rhetoric, etc. I mean, it's appalling.
Why do you study partitions? What does it say to you about today?
I think with no sense of over exaggeration that almost all of the major clashes in modern Indian politics have, in some ways, at least in North India, been influenced by this event. This is arguably the central event of the 20th century in Asia. It affects how a quarter of the world sees their past, present, and future. Um, Everything from you know the idea of the Assam Accords and National Register of Citizens and all of these kind of debates, um, all the way through to the modern India-Pakistan conflict, the conflict over Kashmir, all the way through to conflict in modern day Balochistan. Well, that all these things have their roots in partition. The fact that half of Delhi's population vanish overnight and move to Karachi, and the fact that today Delhi's population is often people who were not there 100 years ago is because of partition. And that's the same goes for so many places. Like I recently learned, and it's in the book, that we barely register partition, for example, when it comes to South India. And I think you chat to a lot of people from the South and they say, oh, partition never really affected us. And yet you talk about Hyderabad state, okay? Hyderabad state, which is today Telangana, a bit of Karnataka, and a bit of Maharashtra. The number of people displaced over that border in the year 1948 was 3 times the number of people displaced in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. Now, just let that sink in for a second. And that's the number of basically Muslims displaced who were then forced to move to Pakistan, but also the number of Hindus displaced into other bits of the Republic because of activities by the Razakars, etc. And I think so often we brush over these issues and say, oh, it didn't really affect us. And I think it's at the root of so much. And I mean, I'm talking about 5 partitions here, and I've been amazed how many of the other conflicts that we see in the present day that are bleeding through because of essentially these activities that we've often forgotten. So the partition of Burma is basically the origin of both the demonization of the Rohingya and the Rohingya genocide, as well as basically both the Naga and Mizo insurgencies, which, because of course the Indo-Burma border divides both of those communities in half between 2 countries, just in the same way that Punjabis are divided between India and Pakistan, and Bengalis are divided between West Bengal and Bangladesh. And so I think we need to reassess the roots of so many of these issues that are bleeding into the present.
Right. Let me share with you, it's interesting you mentioned Nagpa also. Let me share with you an observation I've held in my head for some time now, which is
Mm-hmm.
the decade of 1940s. It was a decade of partitions, the way I look at it, East Berlin, West Berlin, Israel, and India, Pakistan. What was it about the 40s that created these 3 huge transformations that kind of dictated geopolitics for decades to come, even today? What was happening in
Sure.
the 40s?
I think the key thing is World War II. World War II basically bankrupted the idea of empire. And you had nationalism, like rising nationalism, for decades at that point. But suddenly you have all these nationalist communities declaring new nation states, um, and you have um, first, I think it's Indonesia that declares independence, then Vietnam. Of course, other partitions that happened within the 1940s are Korea and Vietnam. You know,
That's right.
um, and I think that you have this battle of nationalisms as imperialism increasingly becomes discredited. You have this big question of, okay, who are we handing over power to now? And who is taking the reins of control? And I think that the story of the 1940s is the story of this question, what happens after empire?
Right. And who you think in India or in South Asia, who is the memory keeper of partitions? Who are these people? I mean, every few years we hear of people who are archiving, doing oral
Mm,
histories. There are new museums to partition now in Delhi and Amritsar, and it's gone beyond Punjab and Pakistan. It's now looking at Sindh. There was an exhibition in the Delhi Partition Museum recently, beautiful exhibition on the Sindh partition, a story that nobody even remembers or recalls or writes about anymore.
mm.
So, what are these little pockets which are emerging as memory keepers? What generation is it? Tell me a little bit. Since you have looked
Sure.
at this for so long, who are the memory keepers? Diaspora,
Um,
wherever.
so I think that this really began, like, there had always been people trying to record partition history, notably Urvashi Patalia, a couple decades ago wrote The Other Side of Silence, which is arguably the great classic on partition.
Yes.
Um, But I think that around the 70th anniversary, around 2017, things really began to change. And I think exactly that whenever you chat to someone studying partition, oral memory, etc., the Holocaust always comes up because the way that partition archivists and oral historians have approached this has been very similar to the way that you know, when 70 years after the Holocaust, people began to realize that that generation who'd experienced it, who'd lived in Auschwitz, were basically kind of disappearing. There was a new urgency, and often with the Holocaust, it came not from the generation who lived it, not from the second generation who wanted to move past it, from the third generation, the grandkids who wanted to stop this from like this memory of their family disappearing into the ether. And when people have very much begun to realize that this generation who experienced partition, the last generation who experienced an undivided India, is vanishing before our eyes. And so there's a number of groups. You've got the Citizens Archive. You've got the 1947 Partition Archive in Berkeley that I think has probably done the most. They're based in out near San Francisco and have created this extraordinary collection online that scholars can use now, where in the research of my book, I was able to say, okay, I'm researching Hyderabad. Do you have any Dalit voices from the experienced, like the Hyderabad in 1948? Do you have any Parsi voices from Kolkata in 1942? And you can literally be that specific, and they have interviews that you can access. As you mentioned, the Partition Archive, sorry, the Partition Museum, has done an extraordinary job in basically kind of creating more awareness about the partition. What's ridiculous is that 10 years ago, neither India, Pakistan, nor Bangladesh had museums to partition to teach the next generation what happened. And I think that that's begun to change. Pakistan, now got the Museum of National History. And in Bangladesh, these memories have been superseded by 1971 and Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan, but the Liberation War Museum does have an incredible exhibit on partition. And so if you go there, you have a whole section on partition as well, even though it's slightly kind of less central, I guess, there.
And a sense of urgency has come in now, as you mentioned, because that older
Mm.
generation with lived experiences and lived memories are dying and are passing on. So the new generation is the one that's actually actively collecting this repository,
Precisely.
right? Yeah. And
And I think that you need to do is look at, for example, the Burma partition that I write about. Whereas I think I have something around 80 interviews or 90 interviews from 1947 in my book. I think I managed to speak with two people who did the long march from Burma to India, because the rest of them have passed away. And the people who I managed to speak to were 6 or 7 at the time that they did that march. Because it's now everyone's either too old so that they passed away, or kind of um, haven't can't really vocalize anymore, or they were too young at the time to be able to record that. So already that story is largely lost, and everything that we are going to be able to know about this story will basically come from memoirs which tend to be written by upper caste, white, or elites, and you lose what were the miners doing, what were the chaiwalas doing when they were trying to migrate, and you lose that.
And oral history is always a ground up intervention in
Yeah.
history. Who is funding these initiatives? I'm always interested in where's the money coming from and why.
Sure. So I know that the Berkeley is basically, I think, done largely through donations, and also uh through I think there was a bit of government funding from the US because they were an archive. But I know that the Partition Museum is basically kind of more or less state funded, I think, but with donations as well. And the Pakistan one is a museum of national history and is straightforwardly just a national museum, whereas the Indian one, I think, is a kind of public-private thing, I think. Project Dastan, for example, we received our money through grants, and we did a crowdfunder in order to do our interviews. So we did one of those Kickstarters where we said, hey, we want to reconnect some people and do a exhibition for the 75th anniversary of Partition. And I think you'll be surprised how many of these initiatives have been that sort of thing, basically kind of ground up fundraisers. So we literally just put a video online, said we want to raise money to do this for 75 families before the 75th anniversary. And we managed to raise about $30,000, which was amazing, which basically funded us going for 4 years or so. Um, and so now that money's now out, and we don't really have any money to do it. So
Yeah.
Project Astan has kind of come to a close as a result. Um,
But you
but
can revive it.
Sorry?
But you can revive it with fresh round of fundraising.
Well, as in, I think we've all now moved on with our careers, etc. So we have a traveling exhibition that you can see in the Partition Museum in Delhi.
Yeah.
And then there's also a thing that we were just taking around the States. It's currently at the Museum of Asian Art in San Francisco until August. So there's a whole exhibit with virtual reality experiences, different interviews, some animated films that we've created, etc.
Right.
Um,
Tell me, for too long in India, there was an obsession, cultural obsession, literary cultural obsession with the Pakistan part of partition, right? And there was a grievance that not enough attention, academic, scholarly, cultural, social attention had been paid to the Bangladesh one. Now you've taken it to, and only in the last 15, 20 years, more and more scholars have written books on and studied Bangladesh, the Bengal partition. And now you're saying, wait, hang on, not just two, there are five, right? You're spread it too thin now. Just when, the second partition story was catching up, you're like, wait, there are five now. Why, why are some partitions disremembered? And I'm using the word very carefully. It's a voluntary, deliberate act of not remembering certain things.
mhm. I think in the case of the kind of Yemen and Burma stories, it's a straightforward thing of the archives in both of those countries have been closed off to scholars for years. And I think both Yemen and Burma have been racked by years of civil war. Researchers haven't been going there very easily. And there was this moment of openness in Burma where a bunch of scholars did do this, and this is where a lot of the research for the book came from, was scholars suddenly going through these archives. But yes, very much they've disappeared from the world stage in the ways that they were once central in the 1950s. And and as a result, I think it's Thant Min U, who is the amazing Burmese scholar, who writes Arriving in Delhi and realizing that there are no Burmese language courses at any university in India. And yet this was what, and people remember that there was, some ancestor lived in Rangoon long ago. Their grandparents made cow sway, but they can't quite remember it. They just know the song Mera Piya Gaye Rangoon. Like,
Oh, okay.
um, and so there's this kind of distant memory of some cultural connection, but that's it. I think it also is down to what India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., choose to remember. So India, for example, very much frames its past as the story of Bharatvarsh and the story of this undivided India that stretched from Sindh to Assam from the time of the Mahabharata. Now, in actual fact, that has only been politically unified once in its history, which was from April to August 1947. There is no other time in history that undivided India existed in that shape, that we all have imprinted into our minds. And yet that's the story that we all grew up with at schools. Before that, either Dubai or Burma, etc., was all attached to the Raj, and you had, Burmese people running around with Indian passports. That's not the story that we grow up being taught here. And in the same way, if you go to Burma, it chooses to tell you the story that Burma was always a nation waiting to come into being and is this ancient thing with roughly the same borders. And of course, the borders of modern Burma have also never existed prior to basically, 1937. It's these nationalist myths that put ancient histories. I mean, the concept of India is very ancient, but it has never existed with those borders before.
The
If that
origin
makes sense.
story is the stuff of politics, right?
Exactly. And I think while we look at these nations as ancient, we often assume that the borders are ancient too. And of course, I don't think that before the British Empire, Nagas and Tamils had ever been ruled over by the same power in history once.
Yeah.
You know, um, there was no Ashoka ever went to Nagaland.
Right. And 2025 is a very risky time for you to be reminding people about this, don't you think?
I don't think it's that risky. I think it's important that we remember, particularly with the current, India-Pakistan conflict. I think it's important to remember connections as much as we can talk about modern politics and the right to defend oneself in the wake of terrorist attacks, etc. And I think that that's a very different conversation. But I think remembering the links which once tied us all is very important. And I think one of the things that I tried to highlight in the book is the fact that in each of the wars until recently, soldiers in India and Pakistan knew each other. And so there was this heart-wrenching moment in, for example, the first war over Kashmir, of soldiers smuggling cigarettes and letters to their old friends from World War II who had now got stuck on the other side. You have, I think it's General Nagra, um, who is interviewed by the Observer correspondent Gavin Young in the wake of India's victory in 1971, in the wake of the Indo-Pakistan War there. And he's interviewed saying, "Oh, have you met General Niazi from Pakistan? Have you met the surrender general?" And he said, "Yes, he was very happy to see me. We were friends in college." And then he's silent and basically cries a bit. I mean, so, sorry, the correspondent cries a bit, not General Nagra. But the correspondent Young talks about just seeing all of these people, and the overwhelming assessment is that whilst there's cheering in the streets, all the soldiers realize the gravitas of this because they knew each other just 24 years before. And I think that that's powerful. And it's only ever going to be that human connection which helps heal these wounds. And it's remembering these ties. And I don't think, for example, that anyone on any side of these borders um, thinks that remembering this past is somehow kind of it. I don't think it's dangerous, or anyone thinks that. I think when we were doing Project Astan, for example, I think we were all surprised by how much government support and etc. we were all given. So trying to do something where we were reconnecting Indian and Pakistani partition survivors. Immediately, we were reached out to by the Partition Museum, which, as I said, has a lot of government ties. Immediately, a bunch of people from Wagah border wanted to, people who were doing the ceremony, etc., came to try and speak to us about their experiences with the border. We spoke to so many incredible soldiers who fought for the Indian military and yet often had family who'd come over from that side. Or they understood the gravitas of this fraught relationship.
I only meant risky in 2025 is because you end up disrupting a lot of politicians' rhetoric about origin myths, because a lot of politics today depends on origin myth, inventing or embellishing the origin myth of nations, and you kind of disrupting that. But going back to Rangoon, you in your book you have in your Rangoon chapter, there's some very interesting caste angle to the Burma partition that you talk about. You talk about how the Chettiars and the Dalits were moving back to Tamil Nadu, and how the Dalits were discouraged from leaving because they constituted the essential services, the cleaning and the sanitation work. And you have a very strong line there. You say, as Rangoon erupted, crucial jobs went unfilled. The city's sewage works had been staffed by lower caste Indians, and after they fled, a putrid stench filled the air. It's almost lyrical because you're talking about a painful partition moment, and you're talking about how it affected the mahal, or the air in the city. And it almost, I mean, there were rules that said if Dalits want to leave, they had to prove, to be able to get the lower deck tickets, they had to prove that they were accompanied by 4 other women in the family.
Yeah.
And so that was a deliberate discouraging of those people, whereas the Chettiars could just bribe their way into steamer ships. I remember in 1947, Ambedkar writing, I read somewhere, writing a letter to Nehru saying Dalits were not getting space in refugee colonies, refugee camps that were run by upper caste government officials.
Yeah.
Also in Sindh, there was a law that was brought in to make sure that these people do not leave because it'll affect the essential services. Now, caste and partition is something not too many people have studied. It's also a question of who remembers, who has the moral right to remember, who has the funds to remember, who has the power to remember and memorialize certain stories. Now, did you, you mentioned looking at Dalit voices in
Yeah.
partitions. Urvashi Butalia had looked at women's voices in partition. So there is this intersectionality that the partition story that is still untold, right? That's still
Yeah.
an incomplete project
So
as it.
I think there's more and more work on it. I think it is still understudied in comparison. To give you an example, when we started Project Astan, we were, the way that people reached out to us was through Instagram. And it was only about 2 years in that we started to map out who we'd taken home. And we began to realize that the types of people who were reaching out through Instagram tended not to be Dalit stories. And I think that we very much realized at a bit slightly too late for Protestant that it had the process we had been using to find interviewees had essentially created a self selecting type of thing. One thing I've been trying to do with the book, and I think hopefully you'll have noticed, is trying to foreground these voices that often get left out of these narratives. In the story of the fall of Burma and the migration of Indians back to India, um, one of the main characters I talk about is a Dalit called MP Mariappan, who was later interviewed by his granddaughter. Um, and he has this extraordinary account of, his family had moved to Burma precisely because caste was less stringent in Burma, and so that they felt a sense of liberation, and so many Dalits did. Burma was a place where they could escape their caste, basically. And one of the tragedies is that when he's forced to move back to Tamil Nadu, um, suddenly he's pushed back into this land where his surname and his skin color and his caste background suddenly redefines him in a way that he's been able to escape for 20 years. Um, and I think by looking at these, women's voices, Dalit voices, Adivasi voices, I think I really try to foreground Naga experiences because the Naga community was very much divided in the Indo-Burma partition. Also, voices from places like modern-day Jharkhand, etc. So hopefully that comes across when you're reading the book.
Um, you end the book with Partha Chatterjee's very powerful quote, which says, every time someone speaks about the notion of the timeless unity of India, you need to ask this question. Why is Nagaland part of India but not Myanmar? Sikkim is part of India, not Nepal or Bhutan. Then you will be able to distinguish between the truths and lies of nationalism we should remember. Would you say that's what you want the reader to take away from the book? What is the takeaway, the read for an Indian reader from your book?
Hopefully the ties that connect us to other peoples and other places. Um, the fact that there's so much, I think so often, the histories that we studied are bound by the nation state, rather than looking at the places where people traveled and people, jump. For most of human history, the ocean wasn't a border; it connected people. So it was easier to, sail across the ocean to East Africa than it was necessarily to go by land from Tamil Nadu to Delhi. You know, because the sea had ocean monsoon currents. Um, and for centuries, Bengalis on both sides of West Bengal and Bangladesh were one people, and so many of these borders erupted in places that borders had never existed before, ever. There was no time in history before 1947 when Lahore and Amritsar had been separated by a border. Um, and I think that it's important to remember. And I think as nationalisms harden again in the 21st century, and we're seeing the re-emergence of many of these conflicts. I mean, you look at the war today, you look at the news today, you see the recent Indo-Pakistan war, you see the you know Israel and Palestine, which we should all remember was divided 6 months after India and Pakistan on the same basis by many of the same civil servants. And there was a third partition that was done in the British Empire that was done along religious lines, which was Ireland. And Ireland has been just as violent as the other two partitions that in terms of legacies right through to the 1990s. And yet there, right now, if you Google Ireland, you'll see kind of, Irish unity never more likely, millions spent on cross-border peace initiatives since the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that it holds a torch to kind of remember that so many of these conflicts that we see as eternal. After the India-Pakistan conflict recently, Trump said, "Oh, Indians and Pakistanis have been fighting for thousands and thousands of years." The fact that we still have people alive today who remember a time when that wasn't the case, I think is important to remember. Far too often we see these conflicts as intractable, as eternal, and the fact is that they're not, and they require kind of complex solutions with political will, etc. But it is possible, and I think that that's the key thing that I would like people to come away from this, is that peace is possible, and that these conflicts are not eternal. Anyone who ever visits, when me and my friend Sparsh, who I co-founded Partition with, we went to Lahore together. We managed to reconnect him with his ancestral home in Pakistan. We managed to do one of those visits that you occasionally see on YouTube where someone, revisits their ancestral town. And, it was incredibly emotional. And we managed to find the family who had saved his grandfather's life from kind of, a Muslim mob, essentially, and had managed to save, it was a Muslim family who saved his family's life, who had then safely gotten his family to the border. But when we got to Lahore, me and Sparsh were literally just like, oh, this is, we're now in the equivalent of Connaught Place. Oh, now we're in Defcol. Oh, now we're in Hoskas. Now we're in Lal Killa. Like, this is Chandni Chowk. And literally each, there is no city in the world that feels more like Delhi than Lahore. It's far more similar to each other than, say, Delhi is to Jaipur, or Delhi is to Meerut, or Delhi is to Lucknow. It's, Delhi and Lahore really do feel similar in a strange way. Yeah. There is a Shalimar Bagh, and there is a Defcol, and there is a Lal Killa. And there's a big Sufi shrine near the kind of like slightly swanky area, a bit like Meroli, and I think that, yes, I think that that's the thing that I'd like people to go away with, the fact that these problems are not intractable.
Awesome.
The solutions are difficult, but I think they are possible, and I think we've seen so many near misses. That's the other thing that I found most surprising, is that in 1960, India and Pakistan very almost signed a military alliance. What? That's a decade and a half after partition. Throughout the 1950s, they shared intelligence. The predecessors of RAW and the ISI, which I think they were the Intelligence Bureau, and so literally shared intelligence to try and stop communist revolutionaries. And those sort of stories, I think we far too often brush over. And there's far more scope for peace than I think a lot of people realize in the present day.
Great. That's really good, interesting. And that's why I said this book is sabotaging the disremembering project, deliberate disremembering project. Thank you so much. I hope this book engenders many public conversations on the topic. Good to have you, and all the best.
Thank you so much for having me.